Hello everyone, this is Isidore, and in this video I'd like to discuss this quick play battle that I had recently. It's a battle between me, playing as the dwarves on our left, against a high elven player on the right. And I thought that this battle was really interesting because of the strategy that my opponent attempted to use. Now keep in mind, I'm not making these videos to berate or insult my opponents. I always think it's interesting when my opponent uses a very unique strategy in order to try and pull me down by catching me off guard, and I like discussing that afterwards. This video is mainly intended to discuss what went right for both sides, what went wrong, and what lessons we can draw from what both players did right or wrong. Now, so first, let's look at what both armies have to offer. On my side of the field, I have a front line consisting of 2 squads of Longbeards and 2 squads of Ironbreakers. Basically, I picked these 4 squads specifically to form the most solid front line possible. They might not deal that much damage, but they'll be able to hold off pretty much any threat that comes at them from the front. To amplify my front line with some proper ranged power, I've also bought 2 squads of Thunderers, specifically because I was worried about Sword Masters of Hoeth and Silver Lions, who I know are really heavily armored. So those Thunderers would have been able to inflict some heavy casualties on those from afar before any actual assault could begin. In addition, I also have a organ gun set up at the very center of my army, specifically to prevent it from getting charged by enemy units, and a balliste hiding safely behind my iron breakers to take down any large monsters. I've also got a squad of iron drakes with troll hammer torpedoes for the same purpose, though at shorter range. I also have 2 squads of slayers to intercept any enemy flanking units, since slayers are both really high on damage and really good at intercepting flankers, and an additional squad of longbeards to fill in any gaps in my line. So basically this is a very standard dwarven force, focused very heavily on close combat units for the purpose of holding the line, while using ranged units for primary damage dealing. For my lord, I picked Thorgrim Grudgebearer so that I can have a lord that's both good at close combat and at the same time is also great at supporting my front line. Thorgrim, with his Book of Grudges and his High King ability, as well as his Stand Your Ground and Encourage ability, will make sure that my front line is really difficult to crush and amps up even my iron breakers and longbeards in terms of offensive power, so that they can take on pretty much anything that comes at them. Now my opponent, on the other hand, brought 2 Flamespire Phoenixes, both to pick off stray units on my side and to bombard my dwarves from above, which is a really good idea because since I didn't buy any, because even if I had bought gyrocopters would not have won getting engaged by phoenixes. Simply because phoenixes deal all that armor piercing damage and would have prevented my gyrocopters from attacking them at range. He also brought no less than 3 squads of Tyrannok chariots to provide both ranged firepower and a very solid flanking force to his army. So those chariots are capable of harassing my line from all angles, and the moment that one of my more fragile units gets exposed, those chariots would be able to dive in and take full advantage. In addition, it's very clear that my opponent was immediately ready to take range superiority in this battle because he also brought 3 Eagle Claw bolt throwers to ensure that even at the very long range, which is where dwarves usually excel, he would still outgun me very heavily. As the centerpiece for his army, he's got Therium no doubt to both support his line and engage my lord. And my lord, even, well, I guess he was expecting me to take a lore master. Lore masters are incredibly popular among Dwarven players, and the lore master definitely would not have stood up to Therion. But Therion will have to fight against Thorgrim in this match. And Thorgrim, while Thorgrim is not gonna beat Therion one-on-one, Thorgrim is durable enough to hold Therion off. And that's gonna be a problem for him in this battle. He's also got 2 units of upgraded spearmen, which honestly is kind of a waste if you know you're gonna fight the dwarves, since the dwarves don't really have that many large units. I would have definitely invested in like melee infantry rather than spearmen if I knew I was going up against dwarves, but whatever. He probably just wanted something cheap to cover his archers with. And of course, 4 entire squads of archers in light armor. Now, the differences between these two forces are immediately apparent. He has not just a numbers advantage over my army, but an incredible missile advantage. At pretty much any range, whether it's artillery range or archer range, or at the range of small arms, he's going to have my ass for breakfast. Now, on the contrast, my line is way more heavily armored than his. So even though he has vastly more missile units than I do have a durability advantage over his force. On top of that, I have a way better center of melee units than his army. So even though he will definitely outgun me at all ranges, once he gets into melee, I will definitely have the advantage. Of course, that's where the big problem is going to be for my force in this match. Since I can't outgun my opponent, and all my units are really slow, I am in a really bad position here, because he will outgun me at all ranges, as I already said, and at the same time, I can't catch up to him. So I cannot force him into an assault that he doesn't want to make. This leaves me in a really precarious position, as my opponent will be pretty much free to rain arrows down upon me throughout the entirety of the match. So let's get started and see where this battle goes. Now, in this battle, I open up with my organ gun and bolt thrower, but unfortunately, phoenixes are really hard to hit with artillery weapons. So at the very least, with bolt throwers and organ guns and these ranges, because phoenixes and other bird type large monsters tend to move around a lot, even if they're even if they're flying in place, which makes them really difficult to target effectively. And organ guns are kind of like anti-infantry weapons, or for shorter range engagements than I just use them at. Which explains why those phoenixes barely took any damage. Now, so here the battle is really starting to get underway. So my Thunderers open up on his Phoenix, dealing a lot of damage, while he goes in for bombardment. He does hit a lot of my forces, but that bombardment didn't do as much damage as I think he hoped it would do. Meanwhile, my Trollhammer torpedoes also opened up. His one Phoenix certainly took a lot more damage than I did in that barrage, but at the same time, I'm taking tremendous amounts of damage from his bolt throwers. Those armor-piercing projectiles his bolt throwers are throwing my way are devastating my line here, and causing truly terrible damage. The fact that my Iron Breakers, some of the most heavily armored units in the game, have already lost so many men speaks volumes as how much damage those bolt throwers are doing. So here his chariots are trying to get around my line, avoiding those Thunderers where they can, and then trying to get behind my Longbeard so they can start shooting arrows into their rear where their shields offer no protection. I had to move my Slayers up here because I was worried he was going to charge his chariots into my Trollhammer torpedoes. But unfortunately, My Slayers are terrible against missile units anyway, so they're gonna start taking a lot of casualties from getting hit by all those arrows. Meanwhile, my opponent is also opening up with all his archers, trying to wear down my Thunderers and my Iron Breakers with relentless barrages. He's really trying to just kill as many of my units at range as possible. In the meantime, my organ gun is doing what it does best, which is ripping valuable infantry to shreds. Those shots are pretty much instantly killing whatever they hit, so he's losing a lot of archers every time those things fire. So here his phoenixes go in the attempt to just wear down my army even more by landing those fire bombs from above. But I think they're not doing that much damage because those are magical projectiles and dwarves are naturally resistant to those. And every time he comes in with those phoenixes, he's still losing a lot of health from my Thunderers and my Trollhammer torpedoes. So he's kind of in a really bad spot here. So his chariots are just wearing down my Slayers here, trying to cause as much damage as they can before they run out of ammo. Meanwhile, he keeps losing archers to those terrible organ guns, but the organ guns are starting to run out of ammo as well. His bolt throwers keep wearing down my most valuable infantry. I really hate that was going on. This Iron Breaker squad hasn't even used any of its projectiles yet, and it's already down below 50% of its health. That's how much damage they're doing here. Now again, I'm just being torn to pieces by all those arrows and all those bolt thrower shells. It's just terrible how many soldiers I'm losing to this. So his chariots are just diving into my line, trying to make use of flanking bonuses on my Longbeards here, and trying to get rid of those Trollhammer torpedoes. He knows those are a big threat to his health, so he's trying to get rid of those as much as possible, but my dwarves are punishing his chariots for diving into my lines. Now here you get a similar situation where his Phoenix is trying to get rid of my Thunderers here because he knows those are my biggest damage dealers. But because his Phoenix is already really damaged and my Iron Breakers are getting involved, he's forced to go back out of combat. Which of course my Thunderers immediately take advantage of by shooting back at the Phoenix. Now here he's trying to wear down my Longbeards because he knows he can wear down my Slayers with his archers as he's doing right now. He knows that, but those Longbeards are so heavily armored that those arrows are just doing no damage to them. Which is why he's focusing so hard on those Longbeards with his bolt throwers. But the problem is that I'm putting those Longbeards away from all my other units, so a lot of his bolt thrower shells are now being wasted on that one Longbeard squad. So again, he's trying to push his chariot into the rear of my Longbeards in an attempt to get the most out of their anti-infantry bonuses and a flanking bonus against those Longbeards. But the problem is that his chariots don't primarily do armor-piercing damage, unlike, say, Chaos chariots, which is why they're having so much trouble getting rid of that Longbeard squad. All that armor is just working against them so hard. Even with their anti-infantry bonuses, they're barely doing any damage. So here he keeps trying to just wear down my Slayers with his archers, but he's starting to realize he's in a really bad spot because my organ gun did a real number on his archers. And right now his archers are starting to run out of ammunition. Once they're out of ammunition, he will not be able to he will be forced to charge into my lines. And that's where things are going to get really interesting, whether or not my weakened infantry will be able to hold off his remaining forces, even though his forces will be completely fresh. So my organ guns will also have already run out of ammunition. They're very deadly, but unfortunately they run out of ammunition fairly quickly if they're not killed. My bolt throwers still have ammunition. They're trying to focus on the enemy Phoenixes right now, as those continue to be the biggest threat to my health. His archers are shooting their remaining projectiles at my Slayers. Now unfortunately, this forces me to put my Slayers back here in a few moments, into this forested area to hide them from sight. That will preserve my Slayers for later, but it does mean that my Slayers will not be able to react to the enemy's attacks for very much longer. See, there they go. They start moving up. Oh, hang on. I might be getting the timing wrong here. So here his Phoenix is trying to chase down my Thunderers, making sure that they do not come back into the fight. After all, those Thunderers, even in those small numbers, will still do quite a lot of damage per volley. Here my Slayers have finally moved off into the forest to avoid those remaining projectiles. But now they're not in any position to help surround these chariots or this Phoenix, which unfortunately does give his Phoenix a chance to deal a lot of damage to my units. But thankfully my Trollhammer torpedoes are in position to do a lot of damage and take off a pretty hefty chunk of that Phoenix's health just from that one volley. So the Phoenix sees this and immediately goes in on the offensive to the Trollhammer torpedoes, to which Thorgrim and a couple of Dwarven units immediately start intervening. However, in order to prevent my other Dwarven units from intervening in that fight, he immediately assaults not just with his spearmen, which take a lot of damage from my Iron Breakers, but also with his archers, since he doesn't really have any other use for those other than to send them into battle. Unfortunately, it's not enough. Iron Drakes of all varieties are extremely heavily armored, so he can't kill them quickly enough. So his one Phoenix is forced to rout and ends up retreating from battle, leaving his other Phoenix to be surrounded. Tyrion goes in and picks a direct fight with Thorgrim, but Thorgrim is so horrifically durable that Tyrion is struggling to wear him down, even though Tyrion is definitely the better fighter. Now my Longbeards just start piling into this combat. His Phoenix drops and thankfully doesn't resurrect, leaving Tyrion to be completely surrounded by my dwarves, and he actually gets cut off from Thorgrim here, which no doubt saves Thorgrim's life, as Tyrion can't reach Thorgrim anymore through the sheer mass of bodies. He's starting to send in just all his remaining units to engage my forces, but the problem is that my two most important units, my Iron Breakers and of course my Longbeards, might be really weakened, but they're still alive. And thanks to the presence of Thorgrim, they're not gonna rout for a long time. And that's exactly the situation he probably wanted to prevent, because now his all his forces have to fight my really powerful melee infantry, and his remaining forces are completely unspecialized in close combat. Phoenixes are good at it, but not as good as, say, a dragon would be. And his spearmen are also good at it, but they're fairly low quality infantry compared to Longbeards or Iron Breakers, which is why they're getting massacred right now. If he had any heavily armored infantry, he might have done a lot better here, since Iron Breakers and Longbeards are not that well suited for murdering those heavily armored infantry units. But at the same time, he's just lacking so many specialist melee units. He can't really deal with even my very weakened army, simply because his units just can't take on Longbeards or Iron Breakers and do any significant damage in close combat. In fact, I'd argue that his archers were struggling to damage those units even outside of close combat. So here his Phoenix, probably his most important unit outside of Tyrion right now, is trying to get rid of those Iron Breakers and do a bit of damage to Thorgrim in the process. But because he's lost so much infantry, that Phoenix won't stay in combat long enough to die and get resurrected. So here my Slayers and Thorgrim manage to drive him off of my Iron Drakes, which give my Iron Drakes the ability to fire at the poor Phoenix again. And unfortunately, that costs the Phoenix his last life. He doesn't resurrect again after this, so now he's lost his most important armor-piercing unit. Now Tyrion is left completely surrounded by Dwarven infantry. He's sending in some of his remaining units to try and break this huge try and break this huge dwarf blob, but his units are just not strong enough to take on my iron breakers and my longbeard, so he's just not doing anything. He just can't do anything about them. And here my longbeards rout his siege infantry that he tried to send in as reinforcements, and that's unfortunately for my opponent the end of the match. Now, what went right during this match and what went wrong? Now, as I already stated at the beginning of the match, I couldn't do anything about his huge missile superiority. His archers could outrun my units, his chariots could definitely outrun my units, his bolt throwers, which were admittedly his most powerful ranged units against my force, I could outrun, since they're just siege weapons, but if I did that I would have to expose my line, since I would either have to foot slog it and very slowly in order to protect my own siege weapons, or I'd have to send in some of my units to just charge at his bolt throwers and hope they make it, which would have been a terrible idea because he would have just surrounded those units I separated from the rest of my force and completely decimated them with arrows from all sides. There's no doubt in my mind if I had tried to charge his bolt throwers, I would not have made it. So that really left me with only one strategy, which was huddle up, raise shields, and try to shoot back as well as I could. And I did. He might have had massive missile superiority compared to my army, but he didn't focus my most important and my most devastating ranged unit, my organ gun. My organ gun was decimating his archers. By the time his archers were at 50% ammunition, most of his archer squads were already below 50% health. That devastated his ability to wear down my remaining units from afar. Especially my slayers, whom he could have easily worn down with his remaining archers. He just could not, because he lost so many archers, he just didn't have the firepower to do so. Meanwhile, I also feel like he picked a few units that were just not that well suited for taking on my dwarves. Those phoenixes and those bolt throwers did fairly well, if you ask me. If he had used those phoenixes more, what's the word I'm looking for? If he had held them back and only used them once my infantry was engaged with his other units, he probably would have done a lot better with them. Because the one problem his phoenixes had was that every time he tried to use them, they would get surrounded by either longbeards or slayers, and because phoenixes aren't very durable, they lost a lot of health every time they tried to engage my forces. And if they had ever come into a position where they could have safely engaged my trollhammer torpedoes without getting engaged by other melee units like slayers or longbeards, he would have definitely won that fight. And if he had routed my trollhammer torpedoes, I would have had no way, especially not after losing all those thunderers to wear down his phoenixes as they flew over my line and bombarded all my infantry. At the same time, I think those spearmen, those archers, and those chariots were just not good choices for fighting with a dwarven army, or at the very least a dwarven army like mine. All those chariots, while those chariots could in theory hit very hard, the problem is that he didn't really have a good choice to attack with those chariots. Since the only units I really had exposed for a flanking attack at any stage of the game were my longbeards and my slayers. And the problem is that my slayers were anti-cavalry units who could have done a lot of damage to those chariots the moment that those chariots charge into them. But my longbeards were both very heavily armored and charge resistant, which meant that that huge charge bonus that those chariots rely on to deal their damage, just they could not make use of that. So even though they kept charging into the back of my Longbeards were just doing what they did best. They soaked up those attacks and did a bunch of damage in retaliation, and because those elven chariots are so fragile, they can't take all that damage and then not break an enemy unit in the process. That meant he had a lot of his money tied up in units that were not pumping out that weren't providing the value that he put into them. And that was the big problem, and I think that was the biggest problem with his force. Those chariots. And another problem with those chariots is that they deal magical damage, which is great if you're fighting anything that isn't dwarves, but dwarves are resistant to magical weapons. That meant that in addition to all the problems I just mentioned, those chariots also got a big damage reduction from the magic resistance that my dwarves had. If he had been playing against a undead player with a lot of cairn wraiths, or a orc player or a greenskin player with a lot of savage orcs, those chariots undoubtedly would have put more than made back their value. But against my force and how I set up my army, they just could not provide the value that he put in. They could not give back could not kill the value that he got out of them. At the same time, my whole army was just arrayed and sitting there soaking up all this fire. At first glance that seemed like a terrible idea, but remember, I didn't have a choice. While my army was sitting there and just soaking up all that fire, you may be thinking, well, that's a terrible strategy, but like I said, I just didn't have a choice, and I'm really glad that it paid off. Just sitting there soaking up all that fire. I think my opponent would have probably done a lot better if he had traded in some of those archers and those spearmen and those chariots, and instead had gotten a bunch of what are those elven units with the armor-piercing axes? I think those were silver lions. If he had gotten a bunch of silver lions and had charged those into my iron breakers and my longbeards after they had suffered so many casualties from those constant barrages from those bolt throwers, he would have done significantly better. But as it stood, he just did not have the melee power. But as it stands, even though he had all this killing power that he used in order to wear down my entire force over time, he did not have anything that could properly finish it off. And that's what lost him this fight. The fact that he could not engage my units in close combat and finish them off after he had worn them down. And in that regard, Thorgrim was an amazing choice in this battle, because Thorgrim was able to keep all my melee units in line long after they would have probably routed under any other circumstances. Because I kept all my units so close together, he wasn't able to rout any of my durable melee units, and those were the biggest threat to his victory, simply because he could not wear them down with his archers or his chariots. His bolt throwers were eventually going to run out of ammunition, and once they did, he didn't have any good answer to my longbeards and my iron breakers, and that's where he lost the game. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. I hope if any of you have commentary about the battle or commentary about my commentary, please leave it in the comment section below. I love responding to people. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. There's gonna be more of these videos in the future. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all again in my next video.